Late last night, this suburban community outside of Indianapolis was rocked from their beds when a blast obliterated 2 homes and ignited several others. Nearly 200 people were forced to quickly flee into the streets.
The cleanup here is going to take quite some time. Authorities are working with federal authorities here in Indianapolis to try and figure out exactly what happened and what caused the massive devastation.
Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. My name's Anne, but I also go by my nickname Mimi. I like to focus on Midwest true crime because I'm a Minnesota farmer's daughter. Today we're going to go to Indiana and talk about the Richmond Hill explosion. This was requested by online, that's all the username said, so thank you very much for the suggestion. I hadn't heard about this case, and when I first Googled it, I thought, oh, it's an accidental explosion and it's awful because 2 people died, but I thought, well, there's not really a crime involved. But then you start looking into it a little more and you find out there's a whole lot more to this than just an accident. On Saturday, November 10th, 2012, at 11:11 p.m., a huge explosion occurred in Richmond Hill, which is a residential subdivision south of Indianapolis. The explosion originated from a 2-story home at 8349 Fieldfare Way. The explosion had the force of about 5 tons of TNT. I did find a clip with an example of an explosion with that amount of force. So this was a massive, massive explosion. 911 received over 500 calls that night, all related to the explosion. Firefighters and emergency medical services rushed to the neighborhood. A house on Armada Drive that was several homes away from the site of the explosion had security cameras inside, and it captured the moment of the explosion. People fled from their homes if they could. Most were in their pajamas since this had occurred late at night. Some people, unfortunately, were trapped under walls and ceilings that had collapsed. The neighborhood looked like a war scene. There was debris everywhere. People were crying and screaming. There was thick smoke that was raining debris down on people, and the night sky was glowing from rapidly growing fires. A thick odor of natural gas filled the air. The scene was so chaotic that some wondered if a plane had crashed or if it was a terrorist attack. Paramedics tended to injured people while firefighters tried to contain the flames. They faced a dangerous and difficult situation because it would be 2 hours before the utility company that managed the gas lines in that area, Citizens Energy, could turn off the gas to that area. So natural gas was being constantly fed to the flames. Firefighters were putting water on the flames, but they were getting fed by that gas. So it probably at times felt like a losing battle. Traffic was stopped from going into the area because there was a risk that there could be more explosions. Residents started to gather at the nearby Mary Bryan Elementary School. The house where the explosion originated from had been completely destroyed, but the people who lived there were not home at the time. The home just 10 feet south at 8355 Fieldfare Way was also destroyed and had caved in on itself. Unfortunately, the people who lived there were home. The home belonged to 34-year-old John Longworth, who went by Dion, and his 36-year-old wife, Jennifer. Dion was a director of product development and technology at Indie Audio Labs. He was creative and had a quirky sense of humor. He was always willing to help family and friends with audio technology projects. He loved nature and wildflowers and was very knowledgeable about them. He planted a hybrid pear tree in their backyard and took pride in it. He restored classic cars and proudly drove a bright yellow GTO. Jennifer taught 2nd grade at Southwest Elementary. She went out of her way to make every student feel special. Every Christmas, she would knit hats and scarves for her students. She helped the school create a positive behavior system to reduce bullying and tardiness. She loved to scrapbook and do crafts, and her classroom was full of posters and decor she had made. Dion and Jennifer got married in 2001 and rescued a dog from a local animal shelter named Pepper. They were also huge Indianapolis Colts fans. Neighbors who hadn't been seriously injured were running around trying to help other neighbors. Some neighbors approached the burning pile of rubble that had been the Longworth home and called out for Jennifer and Dion. Dion yelled out from under the debris that he was trapped. The neighbors could only see him through a hole in the debris that was about the size of a basketball. He was covered in blood but was able to move around. He couldn't get out though. He had been on the 1st floor when the explosion occurred, and he was now in the basement. He had fallen into the cement hole that was for the chimney. He said Jennifer had been on the 2nd floor and he asked if she was okay. The neighbors didn't want to tell Dion that there wasn't a 2nd floor anymore. The whole house had collapsed to a pile that was about 7 feet high. They tried to move the debris so they could get Dion out, but they only had their hands and the debris was just too heavy. They said Dion seemed calm despite the situation that he was in. They tried to get Dion to focus on them and not the rapidly growing fire that was glowing behind him. It was dangerous for them because there was still that gas in the air. They could feel the intense heat coming from it. A fireman came over to help and he hollered for a hose and additional help.
In the basement and on the second floor, 8355 Fieldfare Way, we have 2 people trapped in the residence.
Dion kept saying over and over, it's hot, get me out. Firemen did aim water at the flames. Like I said, it was being constantly fed by natural gas, so they could not get it under control. It sounds like they could get a hold of Dion's arm, but there was just so much debris on top of him that they could not pull him out. The fire was growing very quickly and getting hotter and bigger, and the lieutenant had to make the very difficult decision to stop rescue efforts for their own safety. The lieutenant said it was probably only a minute or 2 later that Dion succumbed to the smoke and flames. Meanwhile, Dion's father, John, had arrived at the elementary school where residents were seeking shelter. He had tried to get to his son's house, but had been redirected to the school. When he got there were between 200 and 300 people there, but he didn't see his son or his daughter-in-law. He checked hospitals where injured people were being taken, but they weren't there either. He called Jennifer's parents and Dion's mother, and the 4 of them waited at the school for any news about their children. They hoped Dion and Jennifer would turn up, but after the flames were able to get under control and firemen could get closer to the house, firemen found the bodies of Dion and Jennifer. Autopsies determined Jennifer had most likely been killed instantly from the blast. Dion had experienced a very excruciating death. 90% of his body was burned and soot was covering his entire respiratory tract. The couple's dog Pepper was missing after the explosion. Family in the community searched for her, but she was never found. I would think if she had died in the explosion, they still would have been able to find her remains, so it's heartbreaking to not know what happened to her. A candlelight vigil was held at the elementary school Jennifer taught at. Dion and Jennifer's funerals were held at St. Barnabas Catholic Church, which was the same church where they had been married. A huge crowd turned up. Cars overflowed the parking lot and were lined up bumper to bumper down the street. The mayor and his wife attended, along with members of the fire and police departments. The Monsignor talked about how much Dion and Jennifer loved and cared for each other and said, quote, "Let us always remember how sacred life is, how fragile life is, how meaningful life is. Material possessions mean nothing. What endures is love," unquote. Considering how enormous the blast was, it's a miracle that more people hadn't died. Dozens were injured, though. Around 80 homes had been damaged, and 33 had been so badly damaged they had to be demolished. Property damages were estimated to be around $4.5 million. A church set up a donation area where people dropped off clothing and other items so that residents who lost belongings could have them. As people tried to pick up the pieces of their damaged homes, heal from injuries, and deal from grief over the loss of Dion and Jennifer, everyone wondered, how the heck did this happen? Fire investigators focused on the 2,500 square foot house at 8349 Fieldfare Way that caused the explosion. The home belonged to Monserrate Shirley, who went by Monsi. She lived there with her 12-year-old daughter and her boyfriend, Mark Leonard. Monsi and Mark had spent that weekend at the Hollywood Casino in Lawrenceburg. Her daughter had stayed at friends' homes, and her daughter's cat Snowball had been boarded for the weekend. I'm a cat mom, so right away the fact that the cat was boarded for just a weekend was a red flag to me. Put out some extra food and extra litter and your cat is a happy cat. If you're just leaving for a weekend, there shouldn't be a need to board your cat. I could see it if your cat had certain health conditions like maybe diabetes and needed insulin shots every day, though Monsi did claim that Snowball had anxiety. But we'll come back to Snowball later. Investigators could rule out a plane crash because there were no signs of a plane in the debris. They could also rule out it being a meth lab explosion because normally with those, there's a smell of ammonia and alcohol in the air. And the only thing in the air in Richmond Hill was natural gas. So they knew natural gas had to be behind it. Monsi told investigators she hadn't smelled any natural gas in the days leading up to the explosion, but she did say her daughter had thought she had smelled some. Citizens Energy immediately investigated the underground pipes and sewers in the Richmond Hill neighborhood, but they found no evidence of a gas leak. Lieutenant Mario Garza was a firefighter with 25 years experience and was put in charge of the investigation. He and his team took on the task of digging through the piles and piles of rubble to try to find answers. Right away, there were some odd things that stood out to them. In the remains of the home that belonged to Monsi, they found the burned remnants of TV remote controls, but no signs of any TV. Monsi had put the home up for sale at one point, and those pictures were still online. Investigators saw in those photos that there was a lot of furniture in the home, but very little furniture was found in the rubble. A picture of the living room showed a big picture of Monsi's daughter above the fireplace. That also was not found in the rubble. They could tell the explosion had been started by the microwave because it was damaged from the inside out. Lieutenant Garza said it would be like if you put a firecracker in a pop can. Normally in explosions, things get thrown against the walls and there's a lot of exterior damage. So the fact that the microwave had interior damage told them that the explosion sparked there. They found an aluminum container that appeared to have been inside the microwave when the explosion occurred. They also found out that the microwave could be programmed to go off up to 24 hours ahead of time. That kind of surprised me because, like, why would microwaves need that feature? Usually if you're heating something up in the microwave, it's so that it's warm and so that you can eat it. But if you need to set a timer because you're not nearby the microwave, the food would probably be cold by the time you got to it anyway. That's a weird feature to me. Some of the gas pipe parts that they found in the rubble were also odd to them. There's normally a step-down regulator on the gas pipe that leads into the home, and this regulator reduces the high pressure of gas to a low pressure so it can be safely used in ovens and furnaces. The one they found in Monsi's home had been replaced with a straight pipe, so a lot of gas was being fed into the home. Lieutenant Garza said it's possible for that regulator to be damaged or thrown off during an explosion, but it's pretty much impossible for it to have changed to a completely different part. Another odd thing was that the gas line that led to the fireplace should have had a regulator called a Dante valve, which prevents too much gas from being released at one time. That Dante valve was never found. Everything was indicating to investigators that this was not an accident.
When we found out by the model number that you could program the microwave to come on up to 24 hours from the time you program it, and we found the cylinder that was blevied, or the same thing had expanded from the pressure on the inside. The conclusion was that the container was put into the microwave. The microwave was set on a timer to come on at a certain time. When that microwave started to heat the container and the liquid inside the container, that container expanded, exploded, igniting the natural gas in the house.
So they asked prosecutor Denise Robinson to come to the scene to see the evidence that they were finding. When she arrived in the Richmond Hill neighborhood, she tried to not be seen by residents and the media because she didn't want people to start speculating that this was a criminal investigation until they knew for sure something criminal had occurred. She decided to look into the people who lived at 8349 Fieldfare Way. Monserrate Shirley moved to the Midwest from Puerto Rico when she was 25. She married John Shirley in 1993, and they had one daughter. The family settled in Indianapolis. John worked for a pharmaceutical company while Monsi completed a bachelor's degree in nursing. She kept pressuring her husband to move to the Richmond Hill neighborhood because her sister lived nearby. John didn't know if they could afford it because it was an upper-class neighborhood and they didn't have a ton of money. But they did end up moving on to Fieldfare Way in 2004. It definitely added to their financial stress, and they ended up filing bankruptcy. They then divorced in 2011. John moved out and Monsi got the house, but she also got the debt that came with it. They stayed on good terms, and Monsi even agreed to not ask for money from John that she was entitled to through the divorce. But after she met Mark Leonard in November 2011, she began demanding that money from John. Monsi had met Mark at a bar in November 2011, and just weeks after first meeting, he moved in with her. The best way to describe Mark Leonard is a con artist. Prior to the explosion, he had been arrested for insurance fraud and other petty crimes. He was accused by several women of meeting them on online dating sites and scamming them out of thousands of dollars. One woman he scammed out of $53,000. Mark had a history of vehicles getting damaged or stolen. At the time of the explosion, Mark and Monsi were deeply in debt. They had over $60,000 in credit card debt. Mark had recently lost about $10,000 at a casino. Monsi had taken out a second mortgage on the home. Less than a year prior to the explosion, Monsi had increased the value of the personal property insurance on her home from about $150,000 to $300,000. After the explosion, Mark was telling friends how he was going to buy a Ferrari with the insurance money. So the physical evidence was pointing to this being arson, and Mark and Monsi had very strong financial motive. On November 19th, investigators announced it had become a criminal investigation. In December 2012, investigators had enough evidence to arrest Monsi and Mark. They also arrested Mark's half-brother Leonard because they found out he was also involved. They were all charged with 2 counts of murder and several counts of arson and conspiracy to commit insurance fraud. They were technically eligible for the death penalty, but prosecutors didn't feel juries would believe any of them had intentionally tried to kill anybody. They were just greedy and wanted money. So they aimed for life without parole, and they were all tried separately. In early 2015, Monsi agreed to a plea deal. Prosecutors had initially been hesitant to even offer her a plea deal. While they didn't think she would have done this all on her own, she also wasn't innocent. She was a willing participant and hadn't tried to stop Mark or Bob. She had made sure her cat and her daughter were safe while she put all of her neighbors in danger. She had also lied multiple times to the media, denying her involvement in this. She also claimed that somebody might be trying to kill her.
They thought I was inside the house. And they want to kill me in there. It feels horrible when everybody's just like pointing on you like if we did something wrong. There people lost their life. I lost my house. Everybody lost their house. It's devastating, and people keep asking me question and question. Like I know something, I don't know nothing. I just left my house, and like we always do.
People also noticed how Monsi was always crying, but there were never any tears. The majority of the photos I found of her, her face is scrunched up like she's crying. But yeah, you don't see any tears. Monsi claimed to have a medical condition that prevented her from creating tears. Prosecutors did realize that a plea deal would make their case against Mark and Bob a lot stronger. So as part of the plea deal, Marcy pled guilty to 2 counts of conspiracy to commit arson, and she had to testify against the other men. Due to her cooperation, police were also able to charge 2 other men who they believed were involved in the crime. So there's a lot of players in this one. Gary Thompson was charged with the same counts as Monsi and the Leonard brothers, and Glenn Holtz was charged with conspiracy to commit arson. Monsi then told investigators everything that had led up to that massive explosion that had claimed 2 lives. Shortly after moving in with Monsi, Mark had started asking Monsi whose name the house was in and if her ex-husband had any claim to it. Monsi told him the house was in her name and her husband didn't have any claim to it. He asked to see her insurance papers and saw that the house was insured for $180,000 and insured for $150,000 for the personal property inside it. He told her to raise the personal property value to $300,000. Mark talked Monsi into selling her SUV. He told her he was going to buy a BMW, but instead she ended up driving a $750 Ford Taurus, and Mark bought himself a Cadillac. In February 2012, Mark first brought up the idea of burning down the house for insurance money. He said, quote, "I'm going to show you a way to make money," unquote, and kept telling her it would be just a small fire in the garage. Monsi didn't put a lot of thought into this, but that summer when they were at a pool party at a house of a friend of Mark's, Glenn Holtz, Mark brought it up again. Mark told Glenn to tell Monsi how their friend Gary Thompson had set Glenn's house on fire and how easily they got insurance money from that. I know it gets confusing because there's so many players here and I'm not the best at explaining things. Monsi said she told the men this was crazy and she wanted nothing to do with it. However, months later, in October, the men brought up the idea again. This time, Monsi agreed to it. They knew the insurance payout for the house would go to just pay off the mortgage, but they would get $300,000 for the items in the house. Mark even moved a car and a motorcycle into the garage to try to get more money for lost items. The weekend of October 27th, Monsi boarded her cat Snowball, and she had her daughter stay at the home of Glenn Holtz. She took some valuable and sentimental items, including that picture of her daughter from above the fireplace, out of the home, and then she and Mark went off to the Hollywood casino. The plan was for Gary Thompson to come over and rig the thermostat to start a fire, but they never heard from Gary while they were at the casino, so when they got back into Indianapolis, they went straight to Gary's house. Mark told him he was a piece of shit who couldn't even start a fire. Gary claimed a cop had pulled him over on his way to the house and that had scared him into not going through with it. Monsi said she tried to get Mark to not go through with it, but Mark told her it needed to be done and he wouldn't take no for an answer. So they tried again the following weekend. Snowball was again boarded and Monsi's daughter was again sent to Glenn's home. This time Mark got his half-brother Ben Leonard Jr. involved and they promised to pay him $10,000 for helping. Mark told Monsi his brother would do anything he asked him to. Mark and Bob were caught on surveillance cameras buying a slide switch thermostat. They replaced the digital thermostat that was already in Monsi's house with the less safe one. Before they left for the casino, Mark and Bob rigged the thermostat to start a fire in the fireplace. But Monsi and Mark didn't receive any calls about a fire while at the casino. When they returned to Indianapolis, Mark and Bob went to the house to check it out, and they found it was still standing, but it was full of natural gas. So they told Monsi to take her daughter to stay at a hotel until it cleared out. Mark and Bob were persistent and still not giving up, so they began researching house fires. Monsi claimed to have offered Mark the $10,000 to $20,000 she had in her 401k if he'd give up on this idea, but he said it wasn't enough. Mark wanted the $300,000. On Friday, November 9th, Mark and Bob were caught on surveillance going to a local tavern. There, they ran into an employee of Citizens Energy. Mark and Bob asked him how natural gas worked and how long would it take to fill a house with natural gas. This employee had no idea of the plot they were hatching. He thought they were just having a casual conversation about his profession, and he told them that a house was like a balloon and would fill up until it popped. After finishing her nursing shift that night, Monsi met Mark and Bob in the parking lot of that tavern. They were sitting in Bob's white van. Neighbors later reported seeing this van in the driveway of Monsi's home on several occasions. Mark got into Monsi's vehicle and the two started making their way to the Hollywood Casino in Lawrenceburg. On the way, Mark told Monsi he had talked to somebody who worked for a gas company and he now knew how to do it. Monsi and Mark spent almost the whole day of Saturday, November 10th on the casino floor. Neighbors later reported seeing Bob's white van in the driveway sometime that afternoon. That night, after the explosion, a neighbor called Monsi and told her something horrible had happened in the neighborhood. Monsi's daughter had called her father John to tell him about it. After talking to his daughter, John called Monsi at the casino and she was crying and very upset. She said it was their house that had exploded. John then thought of his daughter's beloved cat Snowball and assumed Snowball must have died in the explosion. But Monsi told him the cat was okay and had been boarded for the weekend. John thought this was odd, and like I said, I did too, because you don't normally need to board a cat if you're just going out of town for a weekend.
We always put him in a place for him to stay because he gets very nervous.
A psychologist diagnosed Monsi with dependent personality disorder, but testified that the diagnosis does not absolve Monsi of responsibility. Monsi was sentenced to the maximum she could get under the plea deal, which was 50 years in prison with the possibility of parole in 2032 when she's in her 70s. At the sentencing, the judge lambasted her for having opportunities to prevent the explosion, and she didn't. The judge said, quote, "You were a mom, you were a nurse, you were a neighbor, and you were a friend. And in each of those categories, you betrayed your trust," unquote. Mark's trial started in June of 2015. During the jury selection process, his own lawyer mentioned how Mark had tried to hire a hitman to murder a witness. This was his friend Mark Duckworth. While in jail, Mark Leonard had asked another inmate to get him in touch with a hitman and said he'd pay the inmate $15,000. Mark called the hitman, who was actually an undercover agent, and told him he'd give him an extra $5,000 if he could make Mark Duckworth's murder look like he ended his own life. But first, he wanted the hitman to force Mark Duckworth to call 911 and retract all of the negative statements he had said about Mark Leonard. So Mark had an additional charge of conspiracy to commit murder added to his charges. No one really knows why his own lawyer brought this up. Maybe she was trying to get ahead of it before the trial. Who knows? During the trial, Mark's lawyers did admit that the explosion had been intentionally set, but that it was supposed to be just a small fire in the garage. They said it was, quote, "a stupid and selfish insurance fraud that went horribly wrong," unquote. They claimed they had taken precautions to make sure nobody would get hurt, but I wonder if they were just referring to Snowball and Monsi's daughter, and the items that they got out of the house that they didn't want to get burned. And of course, their own selves. Mark had been charged with 53 counts, including felony murder, and in August 2015 was found guilty on all counts, including the conspiracy to commit murder of the witness. He was sentenced to life in prison plus 75 years without parole. On January 30th, 2018, when he was 48, he died of natural causes. Mark did have an autoimmune disorder. Some do speculate that Mark might have been poisoned in prison by people who were seeking revenge. Bob was very vocal about his feelings towards Monsi. He gave an audio interview to the local news while he was in jail.
She's guilty as can be. She admits she's guilty as can be. That's what she did. She killed her neighbors. She injured dozens of others because she swears that Mark Leonard just had this magic control over her that she just burned up her 12-year-old daughter's house because she didn't want him to leave her. So her idea for her to get a man not to leave is to make yourself homeless, broke, and out in the street, and he'll stay with you. And this is a college-educated nurse and a girl that's supposed to be smart and a head nurse. That's bull.
In March of 2016, Bob Leonard Jr. was found guilty of 51 counts, including murder and conspiracy to commit arson, and he received life in prison without parole.
Puts a stamp on it about how horrible it is. So it was quite an awful crime. The thing that comes back and bothers me the most is to think of my son burning to death.
In November 2016, Gary Thompson pled guilty to conspiracy to commit arson and was sentenced to 20 years in prison. That same month, Glenn Hultz pled guilty to assisting a criminal since he knew of the scheme and Monsi's daughter stayed at his house while they were out of town. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison. It took a long time for the people of Richmond Hill to recover. The property damages were massive. Some homes just needed new garage doors or windows, but some needed to be demolished and rebuilt. People were displaced for months and lived in rentals or hotels while their homes were repaired. Some families had to fight their insurance companies who did not want to pay for repairs. One family was told by their insurance company that the nails that were sticking out of the ceiling from the force of the explosion were due to them not using a dehumidifier. Some families had to use their own money to hire structural engineers to prove to the insurance companies just how bad the damage was. The people of Richmond Hill still have psychological scars to this day. This was a very stressful and traumatic thing to go through. 6 marriages ended in divorce. A third of the families moved away. One man mentioned something similar to PTSD, where if he heard noises like the HVAC system turning on, he flinched. Another man who played the lottery a lot was asked after the explosion if he still played the lottery. He said he didn't have to because he had already won the biggest lottery when he survived that night. Firefighters and emergency medical services who responded that night are no doubt scarred by what they saw. For most of them, that was the most catastrophic event they had ever been called to. When some of them testified during the trial, a lot of them broke down in tears while remembering that night. One heartwarming thing that came from this is the staff at Southwest Elementary, where Jennifer Longworth worked, took over her tradition of knitting scarves and hats for her students every Christmas. One reason the fire was so hard to get under control was because it took the gas company 2 hours to turn off the gas to that area. There are devices called excess flow valves, EFV, that will shut off gas flow automatically when it detects too much gas is being fed through the pipes. A federal regulation in 2009 required all newly built homes to include an EFV, but all the homes in the Richmond Hill area had been built prior to that regulation. Homes built prior to December 2009 can still have an EFV installed, but it's at the homeowner's expense, and that can be up to $2,000. You do have to wonder if the gas could have been shut off sooner, would Dion still be alive today? He wasn't engulfed in flames immediately when he was first found. Firemen were there with hoses trying to get the flames back, but the flames were being fed by the natural gas, so they could not get control of it in order to get Dion out. It's not Citizen Energy's fault either that the homes did not have EFVs because the homes were built before the regulation. John Longworth said, quote, "I know it would cost some money to go back and retrofit, but how much is somebody's life worth?" Unquote. A bench in a nearby park was dedicated to Dion and Jennifer Longworth.
The couple's fathers unveiled this bench in their honor 5 years after the explosion in the subdivision.
So glad I could be here. Happy to see this bench. It's very well done. It's nice. It's classy the way it's done. Thank you, everybody.
I've found the best way in my own life and for anybody else to fight evil is that you fill your life with love. You do the loving actions that you can every time you have the opportunity.
Nothing has been rebuilt on the lots where Monsi's home or the Longworth's home were, along with another lot nearby. When you look at the area, it's a stark reminder of the tragedy that occurred there. I don't think anybody involved had intentions to kill anybody that night. They were just greedy and they were stupid, but I also don't think they probably cared if anybody got hurt. It's so tragic to die in your own home like that, the place where you're supposed to be the most safest. That's all I have for this case. I'd love to hear your thoughts below. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.